Every June, Britain marks the monarch's official birthday, a tradition born under King George II and carried on today by King Charles III, whose celebration falls on the 15th of June. Like Charles I's solemn court and Charles II's restored revelry, the date reflects a monarchy shaped by history, ceremony, and a changing world. Welcome to Sleepy Journeys, the podcast designed to lull you into a peaceful slumber with soothing stories through time, places, and ideas. Whether you're winding down after a long day or simply looking for a peaceful escape, you're in the right place. My name's Jack, and I'm so happy to have you here with me. Each night on Sleepy Journeys, we set off together on gentle adventures designed to soothe your mind and ease you into rest. You'll find journeys through history, comforting fairy tales, myths and folklore, the wonders of science, fascinating inventions, inspiring famous figures, music history, and even calm explorations around the world. No matter where your curiosity takes you, there's a dreamy Sleepy Journeys show for you. Tonight, we're going to embark on a gentle journey through three kings, one crown, life under Charles I, II, and III. And just before we fully drift off, if you're enjoying Sleepy Journeys, go ahead and tap follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're joining me on. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming sleepy adventures. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us. Now, take a deep breath and let's begin. It is evening in Britain, and the light lingers just a little longer before giving way to twilight. A hush has begun to settle across the streets, where windows glow with quiet lamplight, and gardens, once full of laughter and summer birdsong, soften into stillness. In this familiar calm, the centuries seem not so distant. This land, shaped by rituals and routines both grand and humble, holds the stories of monarchs and their people, of rule and resilience, of life carried gently across generations. Tonight's story weaves its way through time by tracing the reigns of three kings who bore the same name. Charles I ruled with solemn conviction in a time of division and upheaval. Charles II brought a country back from austerity into splendor and celebration. And Charles III now guides a modern realm with a blend of heritage and evolving vision. But rather than follow them solely as figures of power, we will drift into the everyday world that surrounded them, a world of market stalls and drawing rooms, of stone chapels and wooden farmhouses, of silk-lined corridors and muddy roads, of whispered prayers and garden walks. Across these chapters of history, the name Charles passes like a thread through a richly woven tapestry. And it is this tapestry we explore gently, watching its colors shift from the smoke of civil war to the laughter of a theater's return, from the patience of a waiting prince to the measured steps of a contemporary king. The voices we will hear tonight are touching the lives of kings and commoners alike, people whose days began with bread baked at dawn and ended with candles guttering softly into the dark. So allow your thoughts to wander as you settle into this journey. Let the rhythm of the past lull your mind, let the weight of years rest lightly, and let the footsteps of history lead you towards stillness. In the early 17th century, England moved through a slow and steady rhythm, shaped by both tradition and quiet change. When Charles I ascended the throne in 1625, the The country was largely rural, its people spread across villages and market towns where thatched roofs and timbered halls nestled into soft green landscapes. Life was oriented toward the land, governed by the rise and fall of the seasons, and each household bore the marks of both inherited custom and a slowly modernizing world. Inside a modest cottage, mornings began early. The hearth, always the heart of the home, glowed with the coals of the previous night's fire. Families rose to the faint sounds of animals in the yard and the low voices of neighbors beginning their own routines. Bread was often baked in clay ovens just beyond the kitchen wall, with the scent of rising dough mingling with the earthy tones of hay and wood smoke. Chickens clucked softly, water was drawn from the well, and a day of work began, often with prayer, always with purpose. Under Charles I, the Church of England remained a powerful presence in daily life. Sabbath observance was strict in many places, though the balance between Puritan and Anglican customs varied from parish to parish. Church bells were markers of service and community rhythm, signaling weddings, deaths, and the long hours of Sunday worship. Families dressed carefully for these occasions, their best garments worn with quiet reverence, even if their daily wear was homespun and patched. While the King's Court in London seemed distant to many, its culture filtered outward in subtle ways. Court fashion inspired even the countryside. Ribbons and stiff collars became the aspiration of those who could afford such finery, or at least clever approximations of it. Portraits of the King and Queen Henrietta Maria, painted with opulent fabrics and elegant posture, hung in guild halls and manorial houses, serving as both symbols of loyalty and distant models of grace. Within the great houses of the gentry and nobility, life was more formally arranged, but still deeply domestic. Meals were served on long oak tables, accompanied by prayer and protocol, and servants moved quietly through halls echoing with the footfalls of earlier generations. Gardens were cultivated for beauty and as displays of order and learning, with neatly trimmed hedges, symmetrical paths, and carefully placed fountains. Children in both village and manor learned their letters if their families could afford the schooling, though many continued in the traditions of their parents, apprenticing in trades, working the fields, or assisting in the home. Life was often hard, but also steeped in continuity, in the slow turn of plow and spindle, of harvest and holy day. The king himself, though increasingly withdrawn and austere, was viewed as a father to the nation. His image appeared on coins, proclamations, and in church prayers. Even those who questioned his policies might still kneel at his name. It was a time of loyalty, deeply woven with fear, of stability under tension, and of lives lived mostly far from the court, but still shaped by its reach. And so, under the reign of Charles I, life continued, rooted in the soil, warmed by the hearth, watched over by a crown whose shadow fell quietly across every village square and farmhouse lane. As the 1630s unfolded under the reign of Charles I, England carried the appearance of calm, yet beneath its gentle routines, tension gathered like low clouds on a gray horizon. The kingdom, outwardly ordered and pious, was marked by quiet divides, lines drawn in sermons and court decisions, in whispered conversations and printed pamphlets, in the rhythms of prayer and the reach of Parliament. Religion, more than any other force, began to strain the country's unity. Charles I, deeply devout and influenced by the Arminian branch of Anglicanism, emphasized ceremonial worship and the divine right of kings, views that clashed with the growing Puritan movement. Where Puritans preferred plain services, simple churches, and a theology centered on scripture and introspection, Charles, alongside Archbishop William Laud, advocated for beauty, hierarchy, and ritual within the Church of England. Altars were raised, clergy were dressed in rich vestments, and cathedrals echoed with music that to some ears felt dangerously close to Catholic form. In towns and parishes, these changes sowed unease. Churchgoers debated whether bowing at the name of Jesus or kneeling at the altar was reverence or idolatry. Ministers who resisted the king's reforms were dismissed or silenced, and communities loyal to their local clergy felt the strain of imposed conformity. Though violence had not yet surfaced, the spiritual cohesion that once tethered England's people began to fray. Politics, too, unfolded in a slow but steady conflict. Charles's decision to rule without Parliament, a period known as the Personal Rule, lasting from 1629 to 1640, removed one of the few formal avenues through which the population could express dissent. Though most ordinary citizens were not involved directly in governance, the absence of Parliament meant that policies and taxes arrived by royal decree. One such levy, ship money, was deeply resented. It had once been collected only in coastal areas during times of war, but Charles extended it inland during peacetime, prompting quiet protest from farmers and landowners alike. The Crown's demand for obedience extended even into the private realm. Laws about Sabbath observance, marriage, and public behavior were enforced with growing rigidity. While some welcomed the order, others saw in it the beginnings of oppression. Printing presses, once busy with theological debate and poetic imagination, began to circulate tracts that questioned the reach of royal authority, always carefully worded to avoid direct treason. In homes, discussions at dinner tables grew more careful. In taverns and market squares, talk of politics might be hushed if the local constable passed by. The outward rituals of village life remained: maypole dances, harvest festivals, Sunday worship. Yet these traditions now carried a fragile tension. Behind the laughter of a fair or the solemnity of a christening lay questions about who held power and whose God was being worshipped. Yet through all this, Charles remained convinced of his calling. He believed in monarchy as ordained by heaven, and in a church that reflected divine beauty. His court, richly adorned and full of formality, mirrored his vision for the kingdom. But far beyond the palace walls, that vision stirred unease. The people still prayed for their sovereign, still watched his processions with awe, but in quiet corners of the realm, a rift was beginning to grow. It would be years before the fracture became a break, but already the fabric of the nation had begun to stretch. By the early 1640s, the calm that had once cloaked England began to unravel. Tensions that had lingered in pulpits and petitions now spilled into open conflict. The English Civil War, sparked in 1642, was less a remote battle of lords, and more a lived disturbance that touched kitchens, barns, and marketplaces across the kingdom. It was a war of divided parishes, of families on opposing sides, and of everyday life strained beneath the slow march of soldiers. Villages that once knew only the sounds of livestock and bells came to know the footfall of regiments. Fields carefully tilled in spring were trampled under cavalry drills, and barns meant for harvest became makeshift garrisons. Sometimes these soldiers were welcome, young men raised from local parishes to serve the parliamentarian cause, or perhaps royalist troops believed to be defending the rightful king. At other times, they were strangers, poorly provisioned, and forced to take shelter and supplies from unwilling hands. Markets, once a hub of trade and chatter, grew uncertain. The flow of goods was disrupted, with roads made treacherous by mud, Roman patrols and levies. Traders hesitated to travel, and shopkeepers watched their wares dwindle. Money, too, lost its steady meaning. The familiar coins bearing the king's face were now joined by currency issued by Parliament, and in some towns, both were accepted, though always with a cautious glance and a whispered calculation of loyalty. Houses, from the smallest cottages to the grandest manors, bore the burden of quartered soldiers. Families might awaken to find men in red coats sleeping on straw by the fire, or to hear the jangle of armor, where once there had only been the soft clang of a blacksmith's tools. Inns served as informal outposts, their signboards marking ale and allegiance. Even the church, a haven for so many, became a place of decision. Sermons now carried weight beyond salvation, with clergy often choosing sides, gently or firmly, from the pulpit. The war did not strike all places at once, nor with equal force. Some regions, particularly the north and the west, saw prolonged sieges and skirmishes. Towns like York, Oxford, and Bristol found themselves heavily involved, with fortifications rising and falling like tides. Yet even in quieter counties, the sense of fear and uncertainty was ever present. News arrived slowly, often exaggerated, passed from messenger to merchant to shepherd. Rumors traveled faster than horses, and many lived with the constant worry that violence could come to their door. For the children, these years of war were marked by strange silences and sudden departures. Fathers were called away, sometimes never to return. Mothers hushed their voices more often, and the games played in farmyards were occasionally interrupted by the sight of distant smoke. For many, this was their first memory of the world as something unstable, a lesson learned revealed more in absence and unease than in written accounts. And yet, through it all, the rituals of life endured. Weddings still took place, though more modestly. Harvests were still gathered, even as fields showed scars of battle. Candles still flickered in windows at night, and people still turned to prayer, if with heavier hearts. The Civil War had begun, and though the monarch still reigned from his strongholds, the kingdom's unity had been broken. Life continued, but always under the shadow of what had been lost: peace, predictability, and the quiet faith that tomorrow would look much like today. As the years passed, that shadow deepened. The war dragged on, and with it, the hopes of reconciliation faded. Battles were fought not just on fields, but in hearts and halls, and in time, even the sacred idea of kingship itself would be put on trial. On the gray morning of January 30th, 1649, a crowd gathered outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. Though their voices were hushed and their faces hidden by scarves against the cold, they came to witness a moment that would echo far beyond that single hour. King Charles I, condemned by a court created for his trial, stepped onto the scaffold, spoke softly to those nearby, and knelt before the block. When the axe fell, silence followed. The news of his execution spread slowly, passing from town to village by word of mouth, printed notice, or careful retelling by travelers. For many, the moment felt unreal. The notion of a monarch, God's anointed, being publicly put to death was almost inconceivable. In the homes of royalist sympathizers, grief overtook speech. Portraits of Charles I were draped in black or removed entirely, and candles were lit in quiet vigils by those who dared not gather openly. Within days, pamphlets appeared, some smuggled, others copied by hand, portraying the king as a martyr, his calm composure likened to the dignity of saints. His final words, recorded and embellished, became sacred texts to those who believed the monarchy had been betrayed. In certain parishes, sermons hinted at injustice through parable and allegory, while private prayers invoked a longing for the return of rightful kingship. Children born in the months that followed were often given his name, their christenings accompanied by whispered blessings that hoped for restoration. Poets wrote verses that circulated behind shutters and beneath floorboards, where images of Charles as a sacrificial figure, a martyr king, took root in public imagination. These poems did not call for uprising. Rather, they mourned with restraint, preserving memory through quiet repetition and sacred rhythm. Acts of resistance were woven into daily life. A cup raised silently, a tune once played at court, softly hummed in a garden, a feast day observed behind closed doors. For most, overt defiance was unthinkable. But remembrance, carefully tended, became a quiet rebellion. The king's death, far from ending loyalty to his house, transformed it into something more spiritual, almost mythic in its symbolism. This grief, while deep, remained largely hidden. The streets did not flood with protest. The pulpit did not cry out. But across the land, in chapels and cottages, in halls and hearths, a silence settled, one that held both sorrow and the quiet shape of memory. The crown was gone, but in the hearts of many, its absence spoke just as powerfully as its presence ever had. When the monarchy fell in 1649, it left more than a gap in power. It left a country adrift from familiar rhythms. The Interregnum, the period between the execution of Charles I and the restoration of Charles II, was a time of stern governance and subtle discomfort. Without the crown, the land entered a quieter, stricter season where daily life continued under new rules and a colder gaze. Oliver Cromwell rose first as a general, then as Lord Protector, overseeing a republican experiment that reshaped public and private behavior. Though power rested with Parliament, it was Cromwell's vision, grounded in Puritan principles and military discipline, that set the tone for national life. Under his leadership, England became a place of enforced sobriety. Churches remained, but their ceremonies were stripped of color and music. Altars were plain, vestments were simple, and the Book of Common Prayer, once central to Anglican worship, was discouraged or banned in many parishes. Cultural life was similarly constrained. Theaters stayed closed. Public festivals and traditional holiday celebrations, especially those associated with Christmas, were repressed as remnants of a frivolous past. Music, dancing, and games, once the joys of village greens and town markets, were deemed suspect. Maypoles were taken down, and community gatherings that once marked the turning of the seasons now drew scrutiny. In cities, printed pamphlets warned against moral decay, and new laws discouraged idleness, gambling, and even unnecessary travel on the Sabbath. In homes, this restraint shaped the atmosphere. Families read scripture aloud instead of plays or poems. Garments were plainer. Stories once told by the hearth of saints, royals, or local legends were replaced with lessons in virtue and vigilance. The tone of daily life grew inward. In towns and villages alike, silence was a mood and a marker of safety. Civic and social order became more formally regulated. Local magistrates enforced moral behavior with fines and public reprimand. Watchmen patrolled on Sundays to ensure observance, while alehouses operated under increasingly tight regulation. In many places, communities learned to live within narrower lines, navigating rules that seemed designed to protect virtue by dimming joy. Yet beneath this rigid structure, practical life continued. Markets functioned, though they bustled with less merriment. Education advanced for some, particularly through Puritan-funded grammar schools. Trade and colonial interests expanded, reaching across seas and bringing new goods to English ports. There were new ideas as well, about governance, science, and the nature of liberty, quietly taking root even as official culture remained austere. In this space without monarchy, the crown's absence was rarely named aloud, yet quietly felt throughout daily life. It was present in the lack of procession, the silence of bells that once rang for coronations, the empty thrones in church carvings. People adjusted, some willingly, others wearily, living under a structure that claimed to simplify life but often weighed more heavily on the spirit. Cromwell's rule endured until his death in 1658, after which political uncertainty returned. By 1660, the longing for order and for the comforting shape of royal tradition grew strong enough to call back the monarchy. And when Charles II returned to England that spring, it was his name mattered, yet it was the restoration of ceremony that gave the moment weight, rhythm, and the long-missing sense of shared spectacle. The Interregnum had shown what a country could be without a king. But it had also reminded many what it meant to live in a kingdom, a place defined more by presence than by power. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, England exhaled. After over a decade of Commonwealth rule, during which theaters were closed, festivals suppressed, and courtly elegance replaced by sober governance, the return of monarchy brought with it a transformation rather than merely a shift in power in the spirit of public life. The streets of London, still bearing the memory of war and constraint, bloomed into color and sound, and across the kingdom, life grew louder, richer, and more indulgent. The capital, though bruised by years of austerity, embraced this new age with gusto. Theaters reopened quickly, their stages brought back to life with music, movement, and dialogue. The king himself loved performance, and his patronage breathed new energy into companies like the King's Company and the Duke's Company. For the first time, women were allowed to act on stage, and actresses such as Nell Gwyn, who would later become one of Charles's most beloved companions, became as celebrated as the roles they portrayed. Playwrights like Aphra Behn and John Dryden wrote with wit and sharpness, crafting dramas that reflected the desires and dilemmas of a society eager to enjoy itself once again. Fashion mirrored this transformation. Gone were the plain, dark garments of the Puritan years. In their place came silks, lace, ribbons, and wigs, a visual celebration of pleasure and liberty. Both men and women embraced ornament, and walking through the arcades and alleyways of London became a spectacle of movement and color. Perfumes drifted from shop fronts, and music curled from open tavern doors where ale was poured beneath flickering lanterns. In coffee houses, recently introduced and rapidly growing in popularity, patrons debated politics, poetry, and philosophy. These establishments became informal salons where merchants rubbed elbows with courtiers, and news from across Europe arrived with every ship docking on the Thames. There was a sense that life, long paused, had resumed with renewed urgency. The city, though still vulnerable to disease and disaster, pulsed with a kind of optimism, even decadence. The king's court embodied this spirit. Charles II was charismatic, tolerant, and witty, a monarch whose life blended ceremony with appetite. His court was filled with artists, philosophers, musicians, and mistresses, and though some disapproved of its excesses, many looked on it as a symbol of a freer, more expressive England. Banquets were held in richly decorated halls, where conversation flowed as freely as wine. It was a court that valued learning and laughter, that welcomed foreign ideas, and that cultivated an image of monarchy as both splendid and human. Yet this vibrance was spreading beyond London to towns and countryside alike. Provincial towns experienced their own versions of renewal. Fairs returned with music and merriment. Markets swelled with imported goods, sugar, spices, and coffee, all signs of an expanding world and a reign more outward-facing than ever before. Streets once quiet during the Commonwealth now echoed with the sounds of celebration, fiddles, cheers, and the rhythmic clatter of horse-drawn coaches carrying news and novelty from court to countryside. Daily life during these early years of the Restoration was filled with contrast. There remained hardship, of course, and some families remained uneasy with the shifting moral atmosphere or the royal extravagance. But for many, it was a time to reclaim joy, to step outside again into a world of movement, light, and laughter. A monarch now sat again upon the throne, but more than that, a kingdom had found its voice, louder, brighter, and determined to be heard. Though the Restoration brought color and music back to English life, the reign of Charles II was shadowed early on by tragedy. In 1665, the Great Plague swept through London, claiming tens of thousands of lives. The following year, the Great Fire consumed much of the city's historic heart. These twin calamities tested the resilience of a people still finding their footing after years of division and deprivation. The plague, carried quietly by fleas aboard ships and rats in alleyways, spread swiftly once it arrived. By summer, entire parishes were overwhelmed. The sound of death bells became constant in some quarters, and red crosses were painted on doors with the chilling inscription, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Infected houses were sealed, and their inhabitants left to survive or perish behind bolted wood. Night watchmen stood vigil, keeping order, while physicians in long leather coats and beaked masks made cautious visits through the sickened streets. For those who remained uninfected, life narrowed. Markets closed. Church services were shortened or suspended. Wealthier families fled to the countryside, while poorer households huddled together, hoping that prayer or fortitude might keep the pestilence at bay. Streets that once bustled with carts and conversation fell eerily silent. Theaters, newly reopened after years of closure during the Commonwealth, were shuttered once more, their stages darkened by fear rather than decree. Yet even in that darkness, signs of humanity endured. Nurses, many of them women with no formal training, cared for neighbors out of duty or love. Clergy moved carefully among the dying, offering last rites or whispered comfort through cracked doors. Bakers left loaves at the threshold of closed homes. And in letters written in hurried script, people recorded small acts of kindness, a blanket shared, a prayer passed, a song remembered from better days. In September of the following year, the second blow came. A spark in a baker's shop on Pudding Lane ignited a fire that, fanned by winds and fed by timbered houses packed tightly together, swept across London with terrifying speed. Over 4 days, the fire devoured churches, homes, guild halls, and entire neighborhoods, leaving tens of thousands homeless. Narrow streets that had once teemed with life were reduced to ash and embers. And yet, from the devastation, resilience rose again. Londoners did not abandon their city. With carts loaded high with salvaged goods and eyes still red from smoke, they began the work of rebuilding. Temporary shelters sprung up along the Thames. Parish churches held services amid charred beams. By royal decree and civic will, a vision for a new city began to take shape, one of wider streets, brick buildings, and grander design. Sir Christopher Wren, an architect whose name would come to define the city's revival, drew plans for St. White, Paul's Cathedral, and dozens of other churches. Masons, carpenters, glaziers, and laborers filled the air once again with the rhythms of construction. Taverns reopened. Markets resumed. Children, though fewer in number, played among scaffolds and new stone walls. For Charles II, these crises tested the very spirit of his reign. He walked among the survivors, offered funds for rebuilding, and sought to unify a city still scarred by years of uncertainty. Though his court remained lively, his interest in science, planning, and urban improvement became part of his legacy. The king who had once fled for his life after defeat now stood at the heart of a nation determined to rise again. And so, amid the ash and after the plague's pale shadow, daily life resumed. Slowly, deliberately, London reawakened. Its streets were not the same. Its people had changed, but the pulse of the city, its markets, its churches, its quiet gardens, began to beat once more. While the theaters of London echoed with drama and the city rebuilt itself from ash and illness, a different rhythm could be heard beyond its gates, one shaped by gravel walks, trimmed hedges, and whispered conversations beneath parasols. Across England, the aristocracy embraced a revival of leisure, taste, and sociability. The country estate, once fortified and austere, became a canvas of cultivated pleasure, and life within these estates reflected a broader evolution in class identity and domestic ritual. At the heart of this shift was the garden, a space once shaped primarily by necessity, now transformed into a setting for elegance, ceremony, and careful design. Inspired by French and Dutch models, English gardens in the Restoration era grew increasingly geometric, composed, and rich with symbolism. Gravel paths wound through clipped box hedges, while topiary figures stood beside fountains and ornamental pools. Parterre, planted with careful precision, stretched outward like patterned tapestries sewn into the earth. Ladies and gentlemen of the upper classes moved through these settings each afternoon, their steps accompanied by quiet conversation and the rustle of fine fabrics. Fans were opened with practiced ease, walking sticks traced slow arcs, and snippets of gossip lingered like perfume between rows of lavender and yew. With society once again attending salons, drawing rooms, and open-air promenades, news of engagements, inheritances, and scandal traveled easily through the delicate web of social visits. Within the manor house, daily life followed a comfortable rhythm. Mornings might begin with scripture or correspondence, followed by reading in a sunlit parlor or supervising household affairs. Meals were served in stages, beginning with a hearty midday dinner and ending with a lighter evening repast, often accompanied by wine and soft music. Servants moved with discretion through halls lined with portraits and polished oak, laying out writing desks, tending to fireplaces, and preparing rooms for evening guests. Women in these households often played active roles in estate management. They maintained ledgers, corresponded with stewards, and supervised gardens with both artistic and practical interest. Their letters, many of which survive today, reveal keen attention to detail, care for tenants and servants, and a quiet pride in the order of the household. Fashion became a marker of taste and aspiration. Fine silks, imported lace, and tailored garments reflected courtly influence. Hair was powdered and styled, bodices embroidered, and shoes buckled with silver. Portraits captured features and expressions of refinement, an ideal many sought to reflect within their homes and behavior. Among the growing merchant class, these patterns of domestic elegance began to take hold as well. Townhouses in cities like York, Norwich, and Bath mirrored aristocratic taste in miniature. Parlor gardens, imported tableware, and shelves of classical literature filled interiors with the signs of thoughtful living. The ideal of refinement, once closely tied to noble lineage, gradually came to reflect cultivated behavior and outward grace. As more people embraced this image of gentility, the symbols of status shifted, shaped as much by education, environment, and conduct as by ancestry. While the royal court remained a beacon of fashion and form, it was in homes and gardens across the country that Restoration elegance truly took root. The return of the monarchy offered more than political stability. It gave people permission to tend their surroundings, to cultivate beauty, and to find pleasure in quiet rituals that honored taste, care, and human company. Here, among espaliered walls and blooming bowers, a new chapter of English domestic life unfolded, softly, gracefully, and with a growing sense of purpose. Beneath the manicured gardens and polished parlors of England's upper classes, another world thrived, one of chimneys and cobblestones, of bustling inns and narrow shop fronts, of soot-smudged aprons and the clatter of carts. For tradespeople, artisans, and laborers, Life under Charles II pulsed with energy and movement, shaped less by ceremony and more by necessity, fellowship, and steady toil. In towns and growing cities, the working day began early. The streets filled with the sound of wooden shutters swinging open, of metal tools striking iron, and of vendors calling out fresh wares. Bakers lit their ovens before dawn, while blacksmiths, tailors, and carpenters swept their shop fronts clean in preparation for a day's worth of orders and exchanges. Apprentices ran messages between masters and merchants, their voices weaving through alleyways alongside the clang of church bells marking the hour. Markets were central to this rhythm. Open-air stalls lined cobbled squares, where vendors sold bread, eels, cheese, textiles, candles, and every imaginable small necessity. Goods arrived from the countryside by cart, and from overseas by ship. Spices, tobacco, sugar, and fabrics slowly becoming part of the daily landscape, especially in port cities like Bristol, Liverpool, and London. Coins passed from hand to hand, and with them, stories, gossip, and news from far corners of the realm. When the day's labor drew to a close, workers sought company and warmth in public houses, the true social hearths of Restoration England. Taverns were more than drinking establishments. They were places where communities met, where trades were discussed, ballads were sung, and grievances aired over tankards of ale. The interiors were simple but well-worn, with dark wood tables, flagstone floors, and roaring hearths that served as both kitchen and comfort. Each tavern had its own spirit. Some were frequented by coopers, glaziers, or dockhands, others by milliners or bookbinders. Women often worked behind the counter, managing the ale and watching over the regulars with a practiced eye. Meals were plain but hearty, pies, stews, and loaves thick with butter, served alongside strong drink and animated tales. Laughter echoed against low ceilings, and musicians with fiddles or flutes might drift from one room to another, their songs weaving through the smell of pipe smoke and spiced cider. Alongside these spaces of leisure and camaraderie, working-class life held steady rhythms of survival and skill. Many families lived in rooms above their places of work, with children learning trades almost as soon as they could hold tools. Guilds, though waning in power, still offered structure for apprentices and journeymen. Trades were passed from parent to child, and the tools of the craft, a stonemason's chisel, a seamstress's needle, became part of a household's identity. The Great Fire of London, though devastating, had created a temporary abundance of opportunity. Carpenters, masons, and glaziers were in constant demand as the city rose again from ash. Laborers from across the country came to work in the capital, their hands building new churches, homes, and public halls. These were years of both hardship and employment, where the city's ruin became the working person's gain, at least for a time. Despite the challenges, there was pride in the skill of one's hand and the honesty of one's trade. Street life was rough and often loud, but it was also communal and resilient. People looked after one another. When illness came, neighbors shared broth and firewood. When good fortune arrived, it was often celebrated with music, ale, and the turning of a coin across a crowded table. In this world of soot and song, the monarchy was both distant and present, seen in the king's image on coins, heard in toasts raised late at night, or watched during a royal procession glimpsed from behind market stalls. But the real crown for most came in the form of a steady wage, a warm hearth, and the company of those who worked beside them. As the dust of the 17th century settled and generations passed, the face of monarchy changed alongside the people it served. The cobbled streets and public houses of Charles II's reign gave way to industrial cities, suburban neighborhoods, and a modern Britain shaped by global influence and domestic reform. Yet through it all, across reigns, wars, and revolutions, the image of the crown endured. It adapted, it observed, and in its steadier moments, it waited. No figure embodied this long continuity more than the man who would become Charles III. For decades, he moved through British life as a symbol of both legacy and promise, the heir to a throne and to a nation constantly reshaping itself. His story, shaped by education, duty, and a deep sense of place, unfolded slowly and thoughtfully, as if in harmony with the very land he would one day serve. Long before he wore the crown, Charles III lived most of his life under its shadow, a figure both familiar and waiting, always near the center of public life, yet never quite at the forefront. As the longest-serving heir apparent in British history, his journey was measured in decades rather than milestones, filled with duty, study, and a gradually unfolding vision of what a future monarchy might reflect. Born in 1948, Charles grew up in an age of transformation. The world he entered bore little resemblance to the one his ancestors had known. Britain was reshaping itself after war, and its empire was receding, making room for new identities and a changing sense of national purpose. His upbringing reflected both tradition and transition, rooted in the rituals of monarchy, yet increasingly influenced by modern values and institutions. Charles received his early education at Hill House School in London and later at the esteemed Cheam School, followed by Gordonstoun in Scotland. These formative years, though marked by routine and discipline, were also deeply shaped by the natural world. The Scottish landscape, with its rugged terrain and bracing weather, left a lasting impression. Solitude in the outdoors, long walks across fields and wooded hills, and a growing awareness of the land's quiet resilience cultivated in him a lifelong reverence for nature's rhythms. Unlike many royal predecessors, Charles pursued university studies, enrolling at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he studied archaeology, anthropology, and later, history. His academic path was deliberate and serious, grounded more in understanding than in ceremonial formality systems, cultures, and the evolving role of Britain in the wider world. He also spent time at the University College of Wales in Aberystwyth, studying Welsh language and culture, an act that reflected his developing sensitivity to the diverse identities within the United Kingdom. During these years, his royal duties expanded gradually. He made public appearances, delivered speeches, and began to explore issues that would define his public image. Yet even as he fulfilled ceremonial roles, opening buildings, attending services, hosting dignitaries, he was quietly shaping a profile less rooted in grandeur and more attuned to stewardship and service. Among his early concerns, none proved more enduring than his environmental advocacy. As early as the 1970s, Charles began speaking out about pollution, climate change, and the importance of sustainability. His words were, at the time, unusual among global figures of his stature. He championed organic farming, spoke against the overuse of plastics, and questioned the long-term cost of unchecked industrial progress. These concerns, voiced in addresses, interviews, and essays, were often met with polite indifference or mild skepticism, yet he remained consistent, returning again and again to the theme of harmony between human life and the natural world. Beyond his public speeches, Charles sought to lead by example. He adopted organic practices at his estates, promoted heritage crafts and architecture, and encouraged young people to engage in conservation efforts. His initiatives, such as the Prince's Trust, founded in 1976, aimed to support disadvantaged youth through education, training, and mentorship, reflecting his belief in opportunity as a vital foundation for personal and societal growth. The life of a prince, though privileged, also carried weight. Charles navigated complex expectations, intense public scrutiny, and evolving social attitudes. His relationships, personal and professional, played out in a world of headlines and speculation. Yet through it all, he remained tethered to a vision of monarchy as a living role, shaped gently by time and reflection, one shaped by humility, listening, and continuity with conscience. By the early 2000s, he had become a quiet constant in British life, a figure photographed at tree plantings and charity galas, speaking gently to farmers and artists, lending his name to causes he had nurtured for years. In many ways, his reign had already begun in spirit, even as the formal moment still waited on the horizon. Across the long years of his public life before becoming king, Charles III came to represent a slow, deliberate shaping of royal responsibility. His approach to service was rooted in stewardship, of land, of tradition, and of meaning, reflecting an enduring concern for balance, conservation, and continuity. Through personal trials and public duties, his philosophy took form in steady, often understated ways. His environmental values were among the first to emerge. As early as the 1970s, Charles addressed the risks of pollution, biodiversity loss, and unsustainable growth. At Highgrove, he practiced these ideals, tending gardens and supporting regenerative farming. Over time, what had once seemed eccentric began to align with growing public awareness. His work gained quiet traction, supported by a patient commitment to ecological harmony. Beyond his environmental voice, Charles bore the weight of a deeply visible private life. His marriage to Lady Diana Spencer in 1981 was celebrated globally, bringing a moment of brightness and expectation. Diana's compassion and poise captured hearts well beyond the realm of royal followers. Known as the People's Princess, she embodied openness, warmth, and an emotional intelligence that helped reshape how the monarchy was perceived. Their sons, William and Harry, reflected a new kind of royal presence, more relatable, more emotionally attuned. In time, strain developed between the public image and the lived reality. The pressures of royal life and deep personal differences led to their separation and later divorce. When Diana died in 1997, the nation entered a period of profound grief. In those days, public feeling turned sharply toward the royal family. There was a sense of emotional distance that many found difficult to reconcile, and criticism of both Charles and the Queen became widespread. This moment, deeply painful, also revealed the monarchy's changing relationship with those it served. In the years that followed, Charles returned to public life with care. He avoided spectacle, choosing instead a steady rhythm of charity, cultural engagement, and support for community institutions. In 2005, he married Camilla Parker Bowles, a step that signaled both personal healing and a gradual shift in public sentiment. Through consistency and the passage of time, perceptions began to soften. Charles's interests continued to deepen in architecture, traditional craft, urban design, and sustainable development. Initiatives like the Prince's Foundation and projects such as Poundberry offered models of thoughtful growth that blended utility with aesthetics. While his ideas sparked dialogue, they reflected a coherent vision of life grounded in memory, care, and civic beauty. By the time his mother's reign neared its close, Charles had evolved into something quieter and more enduring, a familiar presence shaped through reflection, steadiness, and gentle persistence. His legacy became less about grand pronouncements and more about constancy, attentiveness, and the long patience of someone who had spent decades in observation. In a world that often raced ahead, Charles remained steady, thoughtful, and quietly engaged, not a figure of reinvention, but of careful continuation. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away in September 2022, the world paused. In Britain, church bells tolled in towns and cities, black armbands were worn by officials, and queues for remembrance stretched for miles along the Thames. The nation had lost a monarch who had reigned for 70 years, a figure of remarkable continuity, whose presence had become woven into the rhythm of everyday life. In that quiet space of reflection, Charles stepped forward, no longer Prince of Wales, but King Charles III. The transition was ceremonial, deeply rooted in tradition, yet profoundly shaped by the modern world. The new king's accession was announced with the reading of the accession proclamation from the balcony of St. James's Palace, a practice dating back centuries, yet streamed to millions across phones and screens. In towns across the United Kingdom, local officials stood in public squares to echo the news, reviving rituals long tucked away, but never lost. Charles's first addresses were calm and considered. He spoke with measured grace, acknowledging his mother's legacy and gently setting the tone for a reign both honoring the past and conscious of the present. His words reached households where families watched through screens, many of whom had known only one sovereign for the entirety of their lives. It marked a period of careful adjustment rather than dramatic change, a reshaping of symbols, uniforms, and titles that had long been part of a shared national language. The coronation of Charles III, held in Westminster Abbey in May 2023, carried the weight of ancient custom, the oil, the orb, the scepter, yet unfolded with subtle updates for a new age. The ceremony featured interfaith representation, music from a broader cultural spectrum, and moments crafted to reflect the Britain of today. Yet its heart remained unchanged, a monarch kneeling in service, anointed in silence, and crowned beneath the vaulted ceiling that had echoed with centuries of kings and queens before him. In communities across the country, the coronation was marked through both pageantry and humble street gatherings, tree planting events, and volunteer campaigns. Schools held assemblies, libraries created exhibitions, and church halls filled with bunting and shared meals. For many, the event became less about the individual and more about the thread of time, a quiet recognition of continuity, passing gently through generations. Public spaces adapted swiftly. Stamps, banknotes, and postboxes began to bear the king's image. In classrooms, portraits were updated, and in courtrooms, oaths were revised. Yet the tone of national life remained soft. This was a monarchy guided quietly into the present by soft transitions rather than show, with Charles assuming his place appearing more as a quiet elder, familiar, steady, and deeply rooted in a sense of duty. For the royal family, the shift also carried a renewed emphasis on slimmed-down operations and streamlined engagements. Charles focused on fewer patronages, deeper connections, and a quieter public schedule. His early travels as king to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland were marked by symbolism, but also by simplicity. He greeted crowds, listened attentively, and visited places tied to tradition and community life. The United Kingdom, diverse and ever-evolving, welcomed the new reign with quiet reflection. It was a moment of gentle reaffirmation rather than sweeping change. The monarchy endured as a flexible thread, shaped by quiet adaptation rather than rigid permanence, one that wove through daily life through a quiet presence rather than overt authority. In the gestures of remembrance, in the songs sung beneath Union Jacks, and in the stillness of a newly minted coin, the nation marked the beginning of a new chapter, one shaped by ceremony, yes, but more so by trust, time, and care. In the present day, the reign of Charles III unfolds with a quietness that belies its depth. The United Kingdom, complex, modern, and richly diverse, watches its monarchy viewed now through the gentler lens of community halls and familiar gathering places, civic gardens, and local headlines. The crown has not vanished from view, but it has softened its light, adapting itself to a new pace, a new people, and a new kind of presence. Charles III, long shaped by thoughtful preparation, brings to the throne a deeply human rhythm. His engagements reflect less grandeur and more proximity, visits to youth centers, environmental projects, refugee initiatives, and literacy programs. Rather than large, sprawling tours, his appearances are often focused and intentional, marked by listening, handshakes, and quiet exchanges beneath canopies or beside community kitchen doors. Rather than applause, these gestures ask for trust, built slowly through presence and attention. The monarchy under Charles continues to support a wide range of causes, but its image is one of stewardship more than pageantry. While state occasions still carry ceremonial richness, the day-to-day role of the sovereign now rests more often in symbolic encouragement, the gentle endorsement of values like inclusion, service, and sustainability. These are the threads that Charles has carried through his life and continues to weave into the public fabric of his reign. Culture plays a growing role in shaping the monarchy's voice. From theater to music, language to regional heritage, the modern crown appears in unexpected places, at youth dance performances in Birmingham, poetry workshops in Belfast, and restoration sites in rural Cumbria. These visits are offered more as affirmations of memory than declarations of might, of voices rooted in place and purpose. Charles III seeks to reflect and respond to the cultural moment with care and humility, rather than leading it overtly. The monarchy's relationship with the Commonwealth also continues to evolve. With each passing year, more member nations reflect on their ties to the crown, weighing independence with shared history. Charles acknowledges these conversations with openness, recognizing that identity is formed by evolving relationships and thoughtful decision. His speeches, crafted with care, often speak of friendship, mutual respect, and shared futures, rather than inherited command. Within the UK itself, the Crown maintains its presence in the most familiar and unassuming ways, in the quiet oath spoken by a magistrate, in the crests atop government buildings, in the rhythms of Remembrance Day and New Year's honors. It is no longer a commanding force, instead a quiet companion to daily life, a presence that drifts softly through the pages of school books and the folds of red velvet on civic days. For many citizens, the monarchy now exists as a kind of mirror, more a reflection of shared heritage than of personal grandeur. In the reign of Charles III, that mirror reflects a nation that is still changing, still questioning, yet still tethered to tradition through a monarch who has walked its fields, met its people, and listened to its hopes. The crown today avoids claiming perfection or demanding reverence. It simply stands, steady, observant, and quietly woven into the life of the land it serves. The light in the room has grown softer, and outside, the hush of evening has deepened into something quieter still. Across the fields and rooftops of Britain, lamplight flickers gently behind curtains, and the streets begin to sleep. In this stillness, the story of three kings, each named Charles, each bound to a different century, yet joined by the arc of one enduring monarchy, draws to a close. From the hush of Charles I's solemn court, to the revelry and rebuilding of Charles II's restoration, and now into the thoughtful, measured steps of Charles III, the journey of the crown has followed the rhythm of a changing land. Each reign brought its own atmosphere, its fears and hopes, its songs and silences, woven into the daily life of people who rose with the sun, tended to their work, gathered around fires, and watched history unfold around them. And through it all, from the creak of wooden pews to the rustle of modern gardens, from candlelight to coronation processions, there has always been that quiet thread of continuity. The monarchy, never untouched by change, found its way through the centuries by adapting, observing, and reflecting the people it served. It endured through the familiar echo of ritual and quiet repetition, appearing in the rhythm of bells, the curve of coins, the shadows of portraits, and the words spoken softly at tables both grand and humble. Tonight, you've walked through those centuries, past the red crosses painted during plague, through gardens blooming in restoration estates, across the paving stones of modern cities. And in each setting, you've met a reflection of life lived beneath the crown, sometimes distant, sometimes close, always gently unfolding beside the broader story of a nation becoming itself. Now, as the final echoes of the day fall away, you can let your thoughts drift with them, like flags relaxing in the twilight, or church bells resting after their final ring. Let the image of still gardens, of quiet hearths, of a king walking among trees or speaking softly in a cathedral stay with you as you breathe deeply and allow your mind to settle. The pages of history continue to turn, slowly and without hurry, and somewhere between them, this story has found its place. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. I hope it brought you a little peace, a little wonder, and a little closer to rest. Until next time, sweet dreams.